The following stories come from the subreddit nosleep, all about scary experiences while hitchhiking and on the road. Hope you enjoy, so sit back and enjoy the terror. Number 1. Disbelief quickly gave way to anger. I watched as my bus zoomed by 7 minutes ahead of schedule. I double-checked the app on my phone, 1:32 a.m. That was the last bus of the night. I live 11 miles away from the movie theater, where I work as a closing manager. 11 miles was a pretty long walk, especially in the middle of the night. Even worse when you're recovering from breaking your leg less than 2 months ago. I haven't earned enough money to replace the bicycle that I crashed. I've got one on layaway, but until I make the final payment, I'm stuck riding the bus to and from work every day. So, last night I found myself standing on the curb, mentally reviewing my options. I opened up my Uber app, $47 to get home. I only had $23 to carry me through until the next paycheck. That's still 3 days away. My parents left on their 30th anniversary cruise last week and won't be back for a month. I started calling friends, but nobody was picking up. My heart rate jumped when my buddy Elijah answered, but he sounded drunker than shit and high as hell. I apologized, called it a butt dial, and hung up before my desperation could overrule my common sense. My thumb hovered over the last number on the short list of people I knew well enough to call at almost 2 in the morning. No, I couldn't do it. She was a bit psycho even before we called it quits. I wasn't desperate enough to open up that can of worms again. With no better option, I started walking. According to the app, the shortest route on foot was different than my normal route. I briefly debated the wisdom of leaving the well-lit roads, but I couldn't imagine walking an extra mile. Within 10 minutes I was hating life. My left leg was throbbing from my knee to midway down my shin. I checked Google Maps to confirm my progress. I just traveled over half a mile. If I didn't collapse from exhaustion, fall into a ditch, or get hit by a truck driver, I would make it home by 5 in the morning. When headlights lit up the street and an engine sounded behind me, my hand flew out on its own act, thumb raised, just begging for someone to take mercy on me. They rushed past a few seconds later, the wind of their passing vehicle almost knocking me off balance. I shoved my hands in my pocket and just kept on trudging. I took the next right, and the sidewalk disappeared within 10 yards. I noticed for the first time how densely packed the trees were, growing almost to the edge of the road. There's a gravel shoulder, but it felt too narrow, so I walked with my elbows in, not wanting to get hit by a passing car, but nervous about getting any closer to the dark emptiness between the tree trunks. There were street lamps, but they were widely spaced, so the ground was a murky dark gray blur most of the time. I would have used the flashlight on my phone, but the battery was already less than 30%. That's how I tripped over the body. The moment I kicked it, I was overwhelmed by a stench of corruption. A sickly sweet smell that made me gag. Even the musk from the animal's pelt burned my sinuses. I scrambled to turn on my flashlight, but immediately regretted it. It was a raccoon, a big one. Its mouth was gaping, its teeth sharp, and its tongue the ruddy black of dried blood. The teeth of a scavenger, vermin, a carnivore. Then my light reflected off its eyes, milky silver and pulsating with maggots. I went stumbling 10 feet and emptied my stomach into the ditch. With my skin crawling and my stomach still heaving, I shambled as fast as my aching leg would allow until I couldn't take another step. My phone battery was at 26%. I bent over, trying to catch my breath as I switched to power-saving mode. I didn't want to be stuck out there without a phone. I knew if I was truly desperate, I could always call 911, even if it meant I had to endure being mocked by the cops for being afraid of the dark. 8.5 miles to go. I hadn't seen or heard a car for more than a half an hour. Again, the moment I saw headlights and heard tires on the pavement, my arm shot out. It took me a few seconds to realize that I didn't hear an engine, but there are so many electric cars on the road these days, so I wasn't too alarmed. That is, until the car pulled alongside me and I realized it was an Oldsmobile. Faded maroon streaked with rust, probably an 80s model. My parents used to have one just like it. I remember long road trips buckled in the back seat, squashed between suitcases and a plastic pet carrier. I shuffled my feet as the wheels creaked to a halt and the passenger door swung open. The interior light came on, casting a faint yellow glow over the driver. It was a woman, young, her hair hidden beneath the black hoodie except for the single strand of dirty blonde hair that hung loose in the front, obscuring her features. She didn't look at me. Nervous, I guess. So I checked the back seat for other occupants. I greeted her, and all she did was nod back. I almost told her thanks, but no thanks. I'll walk. Almost. But then I shifted my weight, and the fire shot up my leg. I couldn't make it another 8 miles. It wasn't a question of mind over matter. I was done. Even so, I hesitated for one more second. Memories of the dead raccoon's ruined eyes made up my mind for me. I practically fell into the seat and shut the door. I don't live too far, just over by Lake Heights High School. Are you familiar with that area? I told the driver. My good Samaritan nodded and stepped on the gas pedal. Again, no sound but the whir of tires on the pavement and the rush of air over the old steel body. I nervously peeked at her. She held the wheel just like they teach a driver's ed, 10 and 2. Only her hands were hidden by the 2 long sleeves of her hoodie. By the light of the street lamp, I could barely make out the embroidered logo of one of my favorite clothing brands on the cuff. I used to have a hoodie just like that when I was in high school. It was one of my favorite sweatshirts until my mom was doing laundry one day and our cat knocked over the bottle of bleach. It splashed on the left shoulder, just ruining it. I think she donated it when I refused to wear it anymore. I was a stupid kid. I never should have held it against the cat, but I hated that cat until the day it ran away. Then, of course, I felt guilty, so I spent an entire weekend hanging up lost pet flyers, although I admit I was kind of relieved when nobody called. Maybe it was my physical exhaustion or the lingering horror from tripping over the dead raccoon, or maybe the relief of taking weight off my still healing leg was sending me into a mild shock, but I was having trouble keeping my eyes open. I needed to stay awake to give the silent girl directions. I focused my attention on the dashboard, seeing spots where the leather was weathered and cracked with age. When my eyelids began to droop again, I started tapping my toes, wishing I remembered how to operate old-style radios. Although I don't know what she would have thought about me messing with the dials. I snuck another look from the corner of my eye. She was biting her lower lip, and I jumped in my seat, seeing white, needle-sharp teeth pressing into pale skin. Then her mouth was closed again, and I was left wondering just how much of the scene was real, and how much my imagination was messing with me. I started to feel warm. Too warm. I couldn't understand how she was comfortable in that hoodie while I was sweating in my polo shirt. My fear was no match for the heat and my exhaustion. My focus started drifting again, and I allowed my eyes to close, just for a second, barely longer than a blink. I woke up surprised as the car turned sharply and lurched to a stop. I heard myself cry out, even as my head swiveled rapidly, my mind trying to make sense of the familiar surroundings. We were parked in a guest parking spot in my apartment complex. How did you... I was certain I'd only told her approximately where I lived. I'd never given my actual address, had I? My whole body flashed from too warm to icy when my door swung wide with a creak. I hadn't touched the handle. I unbuckled frantically and fell out of the car into the pavement, scrambling for balance. Then, for the first time, my driver looked at me and spoke. "Good night, Nathan. Don't forget to feed the cat." I don't have a cat, but my words froze in my throat. There was something off about her face. Wide-set eyes stared back at me, framing a nose that was too wide and flat across the bridge and pinched at the nostrils. She almost looked feline. She licked her lips, revealing teeth too small and sharp to fit a human face. My panicked brain noticed 2 things simultaneously. There was a pale orange splotch on her left shoulder, as if the fabric had been splashed with bleach, and I had never told her my name. I shrieked and ran for the front door of my building, swiping my key tab while glancing over my shoulder at the car that now looked far too familiar. When I made it up to my unit, I pulled to the door, turned on all the lights, and sat with my back against a wall, wondering how long it would be until sunrise. My hands were shaking as I typed a text to my mom. I didn't know if she would get it, although I was pretty certain they had Wi-Fi in the cruise ship. Only a few minutes passed before she replied. "Our old cat? Lexi? What made you think of her?" "No, she was never found. The truth is she didn't run away. I feel bad to this day for not telling you back then, for not giving you closure. Dad left for work in a hurry one day and hit her while he was backing out of the driveway. She's been part of the family since you were little, and we didn't know how you would take it. It was easier to say that she just ran away. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a full 10 minutes. Finally, I typed out my reply. The truth was too insane to put in words. Nothing really, just a weird dream. You and Dad have fun. I'll see you when you dock. Love ya. Then I plugged my phone into charge, lay down on my bed, and wondered, what had she meant when she told me to feed the cat? I couldn't tell my mom the truth, but I think I'm going crazy. Number 2. This happened to me about 8 years ago. I had hitchhiked regularly for more than 2 years. This was the last time that I ever did. When you hitchhike overnight, there are two options. Either someone offers you a place to stay or you find yourself a place to crawl into. I always had my one-man tent and a light sleeping bag with me, but I rarely needed them. I'm a rather talkative and friendly guy, and usually those people that are ready to let a single man into their car and enjoy his company don't mind offering said man a bed or at least a corner in the garage at night and a shower in the morning. I had been on the road for 6 days, and every single night I was lucky enough to score a bed. The second night, I had even been invited to come along to a house party. The third night, I was offered to join some sort of family reunion where a father met his kids for the first time in years, but I politely refused because his ex-wife obviously minded having a smelly stranger around. In return for being polite, I got a beer, a pack of yogurt, and was allowed to sleep in the car. I think when you hitchhike, it's best not to have a fixed schedule or route. It is much more pleasant to follow whatever recommendations that locals give and drift day by day, just a bit closer to your destination. Hitchhiking is not really a way of traveling. I think it's more of a way of thinking. Away from, get from here to there, thinking towards a more zen-like, the journey is a reward mentality. Still, in those 6 days I got pretty far. I hadn't tried very hard, but I managed to get about 2/3 of the way to my uncle's place. I started on Monday, had 6 days of luck, and just when God was getting ready to take his day off, my luck disappeared. An older lady took me off the highway and dropped me at a rather desolate country road. There were still cars driving, but the sun was getting ready to kiss the horizon. If there's something you learn as a hitchhiker, it's that when dawn comes, no one trusts strangers anymore. No one trusts the lone, unkempt man that stands at the side of the road waiting for a ride. And if you're a lone, unkempt woman standing at the side of the road, you better not trust the cars that stop for you. After half an hour of sticking my thumb in the direction of approaching cars, I realized there was barely a chance to get a ride and certainly no chance at all to get a bed. I started walking off the road towards a small forest. It's never good to sleep in the open. The police will bother you, or else drunk strangers might. Forests also give you cover in case you have to do your business, and they keep the wind and rain away. In general, when my tent is in a forest, I sleep better than when it's at the side of the street. I had set up the tent and gathered wood for a small fire. My camp was a few steps from the meadow that bordered the forest, not too deep inside the woods. I settled down, hummed a song to myself, and tried to read with my flashlight as a source. The wood was too wet, and the fire produced more smoke than warmth. I had read 3 pages when I heard heavy steps coming somewhere behind me, branches breaking, heavy, soft steps. I thought it was a bear. I was up on my feet with the flashlight in my left hand and a thick stick in my right. The flashlight was not able to reach far, and all I could see were trees. I stood and listened for 5 or 10 minutes. The light flashed from tree to tree, but the steps had stopped. Shouting keeps them away. Shout with a loud and deep voice and they will keep their distance. You want to seem like a big animal. I shouted from the depth of my lungs. Instantly the steps returned. They were louder, heavier, and faster. They came towards me from somewhere to my left. My flashlight searched for the source, but wherever I shone was nothing. Suddenly I saw a large brown body moving towards me. It flicked from one side to the other, rushed through the trees. The huge stag jumped out so close to me that I felt the warm hair of its body brush against my arm. It ran past my tent, and seconds later he had disappeared again between the trees. The footsteps faded into the distance. For a few minutes I searched the area where the stag had come from. I wondered whether it was my shout that upset it, or whether there might have been something else. With the flashlight in my hand and the stick at my side, I tried to read my book again. This time my back leaned against the tent, reading page and then page and then page. Even when I read the page for the third time, the words still refused to stay in my head, so I just gave up. I left my small collection of food in a plastic bag outside of my tent. Then I crawled inside, pulled the zipper shut, made sure my knife was at my side, and closed my eyes. Nightmares the whole night. Nightmares of someone chasing me, someone catching me, someone cutting me open. Nightmares that even ended with my death, but each time the imaginary world turned black, I sank into the next imaginary forest, right into the next chase. I woke up at about 5 in the morning. Birds were already singing, and through the thin plastic of the tent I saw the first morning light. The uneven floor of the tent was uncomfortable. There were cold, hard lumps of soil under the plastic, but I was sure that I had cleared the space before I set up the tent. For about half an hour I tried to sleep. Then there was a stirring outside of my tent. Some animal rummaging through the underwoods and shaking the leaves. Something struck the tent. A loud, roaring moan. I sat up and slowly opened my knife. The movement continued, more vigorously and loudly. Something repeatedly hit the ground. I was too focused on the stirring outside. I didn't notice the movement under the tent's floor until the dent grew right next to my leg. The dent in the plastic rose from the floor to nearly the height of my leg. I pulled my leg away, and then the dent stopped, shrunk a bit, and moved slowly under the plastic to my other leg. I quickly pulled my leg away, pulled the zipper of the tent open, and crawled out. There was a fawn on the floor right next to my food bag. Its head was in my direction. It made a faint huffing noise. I hesitated. I didn't want to get attacked by a deer for approaching its fawn. The fawn struggled to get up. I looked around but couldn't see its mother. I got on my feet to sneak away. I saw why the fawn was struggling. There were hands around its neck, 2 human hands with grayish skin. The hairy and dirty arms came right out of the ground. The fawn moaned. There was another hand holding its hind leg. The tent shook slightly, just slightly, but enough to make me understand. I jumped away before the hand appeared from under the tent. It brushed my heel, but I had jumped just in time to escape it. The fawn kicked again and tried to get up. The hands that attacked me disappeared under the soil. I saw the ground moving slightly, like 2 snakes under a black sheet moving in my direction. I ran past the fawn to get back out of the forest. I rushed through the trees and back onto the meadow. Then I ran to the street. Only in my shorts, I waved to passing cars, but they all drove by until I finally stood in the middle of the street. A large black car stopped in the distance, and I ran towards it. The driver called the police. I'm not sure he did it because I begged him or because a screaming half-naked man jumped out of the woods and chased down his car. I explained what I saw, but I doubt they believed me. The officers walked with me back to the forest. The fawn's body was ripped into pieces. Part of its leg was pulled into the ground and the neck was clearly broken, but the hands were gone. The officer said I would have to come with him. I asked to at least pack my belongings, and they watched while I packed my sleeping bag and finally my tent. When I folded the tent, one of the officers gasped. He pointed to a small hole right below my tent. Inside the hole was a round, soft-shaped, gray object. It looked like a branch, if not for the wrist. They unearthed 3 bodies. They had all been cut open. I read the news article. The people were identified as hitchhikers. 2 of them disappeared a year earlier, and the other one 2 years before that. Still, their bodies were in perfect condition. Some expert was quoted that the moist and clay-like soil preserved the bodies. As a witness, I had to stay in town for a week, and the police paid for a hotel. I was called in twice for questioning. The first time was on the day after my find, on Monday. On Monday, they only asked what I had seen, and when I described the hands coming from the ground, they told me not to invent supernatural stories. My story was dismissed as some sort of vivid nightmare. A psychiatrist suggested that I must have seen or smelled the bodies and that my mind created the rest of the story to warn me. On Friday, they asked me to come for the second time. That day, they were suddenly very interested to hear my quote-unquote other stories. They wanted to know the details of what I had seen. This time, when I described the hands and how they held the fawn and tried to grab my legs, they didn't stop me. They didn't doubt me. They didn't say it was just a nightmare. They just nodded and wrote it down. Afterwards, I talked to one of the officers and asked him whether they had any hints on what had happened. He said they don't know and that they likely will never figure it out. He said the whole situation was weird. He said that it was odd that the bodies should have been rotten but were still in great condition. And, he said, there was still fresh meat in their stomachs. Number 3. So this happened to me about a few months ago. I had just recently left against medical advice from an inpatient drug rehab facility. It was a small area in the state of Utah called Provo. I had been there after completing a 3-month wilderness program. I was originally supposed to be there for 2 weeks, then moved on to sober living situation. After about a month, I got sick and tired of it and decided to leave because I didn't feel it was necessary. Once I left the center, I immediately headed north in direction of Salt Lake City. I walked for about an hour or so and asked for help from a few people. The ladies I spoke to were very sweet and gave me money, seeing that I was clearly now homeless. One of the ladies asked me where I was going, and at that point I really wasn't sure, so I told her anywhere is fine with me. So she said I could tag along with her. We got onto a bus and traveled about an hour towards the town. I think it was called Nephi. Upon getting off the bus, I helped her with her bags to her home. I thanked her for the money and that helping her with her bags was the least I could do. After she closed the door, I had no idea where I was. I'm in Florida, and I've never been to this part of Utah. I had no idea where I could find rides and decided to walk along the highway. I started to walk along the highway. Within 5 minutes a car had pulled over. The general vicinity was known really well for Mormons who were always very nice, but the other types that aren't spoken much about to the general population are addicts. Anyways, I walked up to the car as the window was sliding down. "Hey man, you need a ride? It's not a good idea to be walking along the highway. You can get arrested for that shit." I said yes, without even taking a look inside of the car and not really catching a glimpse of the guy. As I opened the car and got in, I realized just how messy the car was. I looked over at the guy and began to think I might have made a really bad mistake. The man was lanky, hair was a mess, and had a shit ton of scab marks on his face. We started driving and began to get worried. What the hell was I thinking? I thought to myself. He began asking me questions, with the first one obviously being, "Where are you headed?" I still hadn't fully decided, and for some reason just blurted out the dumbest and strangest answer. "I'm going to Arizona." "What, like the state? You're a long way away from there," he said, grinning eerily. Why the hell did I say a different state? Still though, what the hell could I have possibly said after that to sound like I wasn't a homeless hitchhiker? Anyway, he made some small talk, and I was still trying to check out the car when all of a sudden I noticed something slightly poking out of the far end of his seat. It could fit in someone's hand, and it was all black. I had noticed he had only had his right hand on the steering wheel and not moved his left hand from the side of his leg. Eventually we got off the highway and into some small and terrifying empty towns. We were driving on the main street, and he was telling me that if he was really trying to go to Arizona, that I should go to a gas station just outside of town called the Flying J. I had never heard of the place, but I figured, fuck it, I'll just go there. We made a left, and we got to the smack dab in the middle of this weird and eerie town and ended up pulling into a gas station. He told me to wait in the car and that he would be right back. I said okay, nervously, and he got out. He walked towards the gas station store and began searching for something in particular. I'm not sure what, but I was trying to decide what to do, which I'm sure most of you would say, get the hell out of there. At this point, I'm slightly freaked out, and the curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to check out what the black object was. I started to pull on it immediately, and started shitting bricks when I fully got it out, and it was a fucking machete. I dropped it on the car floor and was overwhelmed with fear. What the fuck is this guy planning? From reaching across the car, I was positioned in a way I could see some of the back seat, behind the passenger seat too, and saw a few blades poking out of some clothes, obviously trying to be hidden. Needless to say, I freaked out. I dipped out and ran straight to the main streets and kept heading south behind buildings along the street. After a while of running for my life, I finally ran out of breath and began walking. At this point, the town had ended and I was on the outskirts and could see a different gas station. I decided to rest there for the night because, well, I had nowhere else to go. As the gas station got closer and closer, I heard a siren behind me. It was a police officer pulling to the side. He asked me where I was headed, and I explained everything. He said that it explained why they were getting calls about a man fitting the description of being suspicious. He asked me for some ID, and I told him I could only tell him my social security number because I didn't have any. He said he would keep an eye out, told me to be safe, and to get in contact with them if I had any problems. That would have been an okay answer if I wasn't fucking homeless with no phone, no form of ID. Anyway, I got to the gas station and started asking truckers if they could take me anywhere, but for the first 4 hours they all told me no, and it was for insurance purposes and that they couldn't drive me anywhere. At this point now it was about 2 in the morning and I felt pretty hopeless. There was no way I was going anywhere. Then a nice woman asked me where I was going, and I said I would pretty much go anywhere. She apologized and said that her and her husband couldn't take me, but there was bound to be a person who could, and that I should make a sign. So I just decided to look around the building, remembering from past jobs that I would usually put boxes in the outside back of the store. As I was looking around for a box that could be a good size for a sign, I heard some rustling behind what looked like a generator. I had a really uneasy feeling and could feel the eyes of someone pinned on me. Luckily, I actually did the smart thing, just grabbed a box and went back to the front of the gas station that was by the pumps. For the rest of the night, I would switch between going inside and trying to sleep in a room where the TV was with a bunch of seats, and sitting outside hoping someone would offer me a ride. At around 4 a.m., I went outside and sat back down holding the sign. The way I faced, the right side of me is where truckers would go and fill their tanks, so in the front was the road. The lights would reach the street, but where the grass started, it was pitch black. At least that's what I remember. Anyway, I could barely make out someone standing in the darkness, not moving. It creeped me out, but I could feel the piercing stare pinned on me, but I couldn't really make it out. I went back inside and sat down in the sort of lobby and looked out the window. He was gone. Eventually, at around 6 a.m., a man came up to me and offered me a ride to Phoenix. I happily accepted, and he went to shower at the station, and we began walking. When we finally got to the truck, I hopped into the passenger side, and now I had a full view of the entire front and back of the store. As the trucker turned on the engine, I immediately started shitting bricks. Behind the store, peeking out, head tilted and glaring at me, was the fucking machete man. What the hell? Holy fuck, man. I'm so glad someone took me with them. Nobody would have found me if this guy took me. My parents didn't know where I would be or be going, and I probably would be in his basement right now if I didn't decide to leave that Flying J with the generous trucker. Number 4. So this is difficult to write. Trying to remember every detail of an afternoon that took place 25 years ago. I'm guessing I was 5, maybe 4, who knows. My dad and I were on vacation, some lake towards Nevada or in Nevada. Now that I'm older, I would have to guess Lake Mead or Lake Havasu. It was a long way away from Los Angeles, and it was a miracle that my father's truck made the trip. It was just him and I. We were all we had. We didn't have much money, but my father worked his fingers to the bones as a roofer in what was essentially desert. The lake wasn't anything spectacular. We had a good time and left. It is there that things got bad. Our 70s era white Ford pickup truck broke down somewhere early in the trip. We were still in Arizona and had a long road ahead of us and no way of making it. Our truck was towed and we were left stranded with little money. This was in 1988, so cell phones were science fiction. Even if we had been able to call, there was no one to call. My dad and I were alone in the United States. We were left with no other option than to hitchhike. We stood for a long while. We were away from any interstate and had mostly traveled smaller 2-lane roads. We'd been waiting 6 hours with no one picking us up, just a few people driving by. I remember the heat and the red sun. It was later in the evening and the sun was getting lower and growing deeper. A car drove by going in the opposite direction, an old brown rusted Cadillac. As soon as it passed, it made a U-turn and pulled next to us. Need a ride? He looked like an overweight biker. He had long blonde hair and had a sleeveless leather jacket. He had dark glasses, and even though you couldn't see his eyes, it was easy to take notice that he didn't look at us when he spoke. He seemed too tired to turn his head to face us. His nearly obese arm fell out of the passenger window. He seemed to be a tall, overweight man. We couldn't see the driver. We were grateful to have someone offer to pick us up after standing in the Nevada sun for half a day. My father and I got into the back seat. The floorboard was covered in tools, and it appeared to be 1 foot deep of drop-forged metals and car parts. I was young, but immediately I noticed that something was not right. The passenger was sweating, and it was bigger and quite a bit more muscular than his slow-witted passenger. This man seemed hyper. I knew enough about drugs to know that this man and his passenger were on them. Looking back, I now know the driver was on meth and the passenger was likely on heroin. The look on my dad's face was something I've never seen before. He was scared. His face revealed his emotions. It took him a second to compose himself. The nature of the subject of the conversation is forgotten to me. It was mostly sporadic small talk. My dad, being the quiet man he was, would give a short, abrupt answer, and the driver would spout off again about another subject in a heated and convicted tone. They made various attempts to lighten the mood, but it was difficult to be calm when a 200-plus-pound biker on meth was laughing uncontrollably. Occasionally he would stop and look at us and smile. Over the years I realized the true nature of the smile, and it had left me a bit unnerved. "There's a shortcut up ahead. It will take us over the mountains and onto the freeway." The mountains were on our left, and they seemed incredibly imposing. The sun was no longer hitting the empty valley we were in. I looked and saw no vehicles behind or in front of us. The driver stared at me afterwards. I looked at my dad again, and the look on his face changed. He looked terrifying. There was no emotion, and he stared coldly at the driver. My father is 5'5" and played soccer and football in college. He didn't look like it, but the shy, easy-mannered 26-year-old man was a fucking wrecking ball when he was angry. Right now I watched as he stared at the driver, and his face was resolute. "My son needs to use the bathroom. Can you stop?" The high meth addict stopping the car seemed unlikely. I knew somehow that we no longer had a say in what would happen. He turned around and looked at me as he drove. "You need to go?" I was being interrogated. I knew to go along and nodded. I forgot to stop looking scared, and I was close to crying. Regardless, I couldn't have stopped. "Are you sure? We could stop at the cutoff further up ahead." "No, he needs to go now." My father no longer seemed uneasy. I remember my father smiled at the driver, and the driver's attitude seemed odd. It was just simply different. I looked down in my father's hand and was truly terrified. He held the biggest screwdriver I'd ever seen. I hadn't noticed that at some point my father picked up the thick, incredibly long screwdriver and had worked his way to the center of the back seat. I stared at his hand, and I was scared that my dad was about to kill this man. The driver had no way of knowing that my dad now had a weapon, but I could tell he was now scared. Then we rolled to a stop. My dad pushed me out of the driver's side and sat behind the driver for a second. He leaned forward with the screwdriver at the back of the seat. He was ready and able to pierce both the seat and the driver. "Thanks for the ride. I think this is good enough." We got out, and without any more words being said, they drove off, but not before making a U-turn heading back to the 20 minutes we drove prior to. I didn't realize it, but somewhere along the ride I had soiled myself. We only waited a few minutes before a nice older man had picked us up. He told us the shortcut was a dirt road that led into the mountains. The older man took us all the way to Los Angeles, and I remember arriving in the morning. I still think to this day, what would have happened if we stayed in the car with the two drugged out men? I hope you've been enjoying the stories. If so, please support by liking the videos, subscribing, and signing up for notifications. As I said before, we're going to start regularly posting horror videos on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and our international series will be posted every Thursday, so please follow with us and keep continuing to enjoy our videos.